Hello and welcome to Likhawat. I'm Gautam Choubey, your host, and this is a show about the books of Bharat, written in many languages, published in different parts of the country, and yet rooted in the singularity of Indian ethos. From fiction to non-fiction, from instant bestsellers to timeless classics. On each episode of Likhawat, we will take up a book of national resonance, a book that best represents an era, an author, or a literary culture. We will also be joined by a special guest, somebody who is privy to the intimate story of the book as it was imagined, written, published, and read. The book on this episode is Amrit Rai's Kalam Ka Sipahi. Born on July 31st, 1880, in Lamhi, Uttar Pradesh, Premchand was the face of Indian writers during the early decades of the 20th century. A novelist, essayist, editor, teacher, and above all, a nationalist, Premchand voiced the aspirations of the people of India. Being a government servant, he wasn't at liberty to write against the British misrule in Bharat. And so in 1910, Nawab Rai assumed the name Premchand and wrote pseudonymously for many years. His stories are rooted in realism, reflecting the harsh realities of Indian society and the complexities of human relationships. Some of his notable works include Godan, Gaban, Seva Sadan, and Rangbhumi. Many of his works have been adapted in cinema and TV by Satyajit Ray, K. Subramaniam, Trilok Jetli, and Gulzar, among others. Despite his untimely death in 1936, Premchand's legacy lives on through his literary masterpieces, which continue to resonate with people from all walks of life. Amrit Rai was a prolific writer who wrote in both Hindi and Urdu and distinguishing himself as a novelist, short story writer, dramatist, biographer, and translator. He has many published works to his credit. He is known for such novels as Beej, Nagfani Ka Desh, Hathi Ke Daat, and Sukh Dukh. His biography of Premchand, Kalam Ka Sipahi, earned him a Sahitya Academy Award in 1963. Our guest joining us today is Professor Harish Trivedi. Professor Harish Trivedi, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Professor Saab, you are a former professor of English at Delhi University, and you are a global ambassador of Indian literature. And the way I look at it, you are one of the leading figures in post-colonial thoughts globally, perhaps the most important figure in India, with a scholarship that encompasses Hindi, Sanskrit, and Urdu, in addition to, of course, English. You're also a translator of great acclaim. And might I suggest that your exploits have made translation appear more respectable as an exercise. And yet, to the best of my knowledge, this is the only book-length translation that you have undertaken, the translation of Kalam Ka Sipahi, and that too several decades ago in 1982. So what is it about this book that you allow its centrality to go uncontested in your body of works? Why is this book so important?
Thank you, Gautam, for all the wonderfully nice things you said about me in the beginning. I don't hear that too often in this kind of way, so I'm grateful for that. Also for reminding me how old I am, that I translated this book about 4 decades ago, and also for the very romantic suggestion that I like this book so much, I like translating it so much that I never translated another book. That sounds like a monogamous translator, once married to one book, never looking again at another book. But unfortunately, that's not true. In the very first edition of my translation that came out in 1982, on the back cover, in the lines about me, it already said that I'm translating a novel by Muktibodh. He wrote only one novel, a short novel, and I was translating it until I found that the text, the printed text of the translation was quite garbled. And I tried to access the manuscript, and it didn't happen, so I thought I might give it up. What's the use of translating a garbled text? Later on, I also started translating another book. And by then, I was convinced, my thinking had changed, had evolved, that for us to translate into English from our languages is a very useful thing to do.
Right.
But even more useful will be for us to translate from English into our own languages. When we translate into English, ultimately we are enriching English. We may be projecting our own literature.
Right.
Similarly, some of us who are really bilingual need to translate into our own language. So I picked up A Passage to India, which I think is the best book perhaps written by a Westerner about India. And I was about 2/5 of the way into it, nearly half, when someone told me that I need to write to the copyright holders. And I wrote to them, and it was the University of Cambridge, King's College, and they wrote me a very colonial letter.
Right.
Denying me permission. So I've tried twice to translate other books. Also, I think because I began teaching translation, as you know, at the University of Delhi at the MPhil level, because I began writing about translation, that somehow displaced the idea of translating a book, which I found a number of other people were doing already. There is a couplet by Firaq Sahab, which comes to mind. आए थे हंसते खेलते मैखाने में फिराक, जब पी चुके शराब तो संजीदा हो गए. So I translated this book, Kalam Ka Sipahi, when I did not know much about translation theory, when I did not know anything about how translation should be done or should not be done. The more I got into it, the more difficult that translation became. So I went into translating this book happily, merrily, carelessly. But once I began teaching translation, thinking about translation, I could not attempt it again so lightly. जब पी चुके शराब तो संजीदा हो गए.
But Kalam Ka Sipahi is considered a classic, a classic of Hindi literature in general, and of biography in particular. And Amrit Rai calls it a novel whose hero is a man called Premchand. A claim that brings to mind Avara Masiha, Vishnu Prabhakar's novelized account of Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay. And yet when we look at the book's production, it stresses the interrelationship between the subject and the author. Written by Amrit Rai, son of Premchand, introduced by Alok Rai, grandson of Premchand. So how does this biography then compare to other biographies of Premchand in terms of its truth claim? How do you look at this relationship?
You make it sound like dynastic succession. And in that case, I become the interloper into that family circle. But there are two aspects of it.
That is the claim made on the cover.
Yeah, I know. Amrit Rai wrote that while writing that book, he got as much enjoyment as he would out of a creative book that he would be writing. Many people asked him while he was 5 years he spent writing this book, and many of his friends asked me, but aren't you writing something of your own? And he said, this is my own. And his ambition in life was to be acclaimed as a good novelist, if not a great novelist. And that's why he made that remark about this book too being a novel whose hero was Premchand.
Because he has other novels too.
Many other novels, but nothing succeeded as much as this one. Yeah, novel or biography. About the novel, one thing to remark is, if someone writes a biography of a person not related to them, they write it in a certain kind of way. If they're related to the person and as intimately as Amrit Rai, younger son, then perhaps they feel a greater degree of intimacy, inwardness, privilege, and therefore they also feel consciously or unconsciously that they can take certain liberties which an objective biographer perhaps would not have wanted to take or dared to take.
Like rebuke the subject.
Yeah. And also, sometimes when Premchand does something unexpected, he immediately steps in, Amrit Rai, and says, so what could have happened that made Premchand do it? How did he do it? He is apologetic. He tries to, for example, when Premchand says, I'm switching from Urdu to Hindi.
Right.
And then he writes a sentence which most people have ignored because one doesn't know what to do with it. He says to his most intimate friend, Dayanarayan Nigam, in a letter, he says, which Hindu has ever flourished by writing in Urdu that I will? It's a very unsettling remark.
Often ignored.
Yeah. And Amrit Rai then steps in and says, oh, what happened? What kind of hurt could have been caused Premchand to make him say this? So he also uses the privileges of an omniscient narrator in free indirect speech, sometimes speaking on behalf of Premchand.
But Madan Gopal also had the privilege of the letters. He was the first one to collect letters of Premchand. He talks about how he went across India and spent a great deal of money and time collecting those letters. Did he not have those privileges?
He wasn't a son. No, he was a very assiduous biographer.
Right.
And he was a very highly educated man, sophisticated man. Right. He knew Urdu perhaps slightly better than Amrit Rai did, right, in which Premchand began. He also knew Hindi, of course. He edited the collected works of Premchand in Urdu, right, in his ripe old age. Right. So he was a Premchand man through and through. And he started his work, as you say, biographical work on Premchand before Amrit Rai. Right. Amrit Rai was still a student when he published his first book in the 1940s on Premchand, Madan Gopal. Right. I knew him as well. I knew both of them quite well.
Right. In fact, Madan Gopal calls Kalam Ka Mazdoor a commitment, fulfillment of a commitment that he had made back in 1944, when he first published the book on Premchand.
Exactly. And, he felt, Madan Gopal felt that he had been preempted by Amrit Rai. Right. Because he was the government official, he was posted from place to place. He did not have the kind of time that Amrit Rai had, who was a completely free man. I should not be saying this, not only because of his own earnings as a writer. No, not only fellowships. Where did the royalties of Premchand go? They went to his two sons. Yeah. So he was a free man in that sense, independent person, who could devote all his time to whatever he wanted, which Madan Gopal could not. So he was a bit miffed that the biography, he cooperated with Amrit Rai thoroughly, sharing the letters, sending him copies of everything that he had. And then they fell out when the Sahitya Academy Award was announced for Kalam Ka Sipahi. As you say, I was privy to all this in the sense that I witnessed all this. And I heard both the Gospels, Amrit Rai's version and Madan Gopal's version, and some other people's versions too. He filed a court case, Madan Gopal, and there was a stay on the award of the Sahitya Academy Prize. Right. But then they reconciled later.
But if you look at the book, the way Premchand is projected, the book is prefaced by 3 incidents, and each stressing the...
In Amrit Rai.
In Kalam Ka Sipahi, the ordinariness of Premchand's appearance, the affability of his manners, how he carried no aura about him beyond that of an average nondescript individual, which often led to embarrassing episodes of misrecognition. It also establishes him as a family man, somebody who was very fond of playing with his grandchildren, and somebody who hoped to lead a retired life back in his native village, Lamhi. So how do you look at this aspect of Premchand as a family man, the pull of Lamhi, or the kind of shaping influence the village life may have had on his writings?
Well, yes, he is a very affectionate man. He was a loving man. He was a man who was kind to everyone, more or less. As about being a family man, he had a very formidable wife who kept him on the straight and narrow. Shivrani Devi, I knew her too. Right. I had the great joy. In Banaras, there is a house which belonged to Shripat Rai as a tenant, I think, not as an owner, long-term tenant, decades of tenancy, which I stayed for 6 months. And Shivrani Devi used to come from Allahabad to stay there for 3 or 4 months every year. So we stayed in the same building for that period. And even in Allahabad, where she spent her time between Shripat Rai, the elder son, and Amrit Rai, the younger son, nobody ever dreamt of taking any liberties with her. Right. She was quite formidable. She kept to herself. She ate pan all the time, which she herself prepared. As about Premchand playing with grandsons, I don't know where you read that, because he had no grandsons. He died at the age of 56.
Right.
And then...
while he's in Bombay, he's writing these letters to his wife that, while I'm here, I feel all alone. and I long for a life where I have the leisure to play with my grandchildren.
Oh, that was all in the future. There were no grandsons. Neither son was married.
Yes.
In fact, when he died, Amrit Rai was only 14. So it would have been a crime for him to be married. Shripat Rai was about 18, 20 or something like that, but they were not married. You know, what he dreamt was a happy retirement. And retirement not doing nothing. Retirement devoted wholly to writing. That was his ultimate dream, that he would be free of economic worries. He'd have to do nothing by way of pressure to earn his living. That he would, what he said in Urdu stayed with him all his life. So he said in a letter, Goshaye Afiyat, which is a lovely phrase, my own cozy corner, my comfort zone, in which he wanted to stay and write as and when he liked, as much he liked, without any financial worry in the world about having to earn money to keep going. That was his dream, and the grandsons were a bonus.
No, but about financial independence, Amrit Rai throughout the biography sounds very critical of Premchand's obsession with owning a printing press. He likens it to the dream of an incorrigible dreamer. And my own sense of the print history during the colonial period suggests that it was a temptation that many succumbed to, of course, with varying degrees of failure. So how do you look at Premchand and his press and his two journals?
You're very right. You know, in those days, the 1910s and 20s and even 30s, it was quite possible in the Hindi world to set up a private press and to try and keep it going. And major writers who sold a lot were tempted not to get a little bit of money, 10%, 15%. Premchand, sometimes when he was famous, he got even 20% royalties, which was extraordinary. And he deserved every bit of it. But all writers were tempted to publish, not all, many more enterprising writers were tempted to publish their own books, so that the publisher will have nothing and all the earnings would come to the writer. Now, this, as you say, was a kind of a pipe dream for most of them.
Right.
Very few persons made a success of it. One was Upendranath Ashk in Allahabad with Neelah Prakashan.
Right.
Premchand too, it's not that the press always ran at a loss.
Right.
If you read the correspondence, it's a bleeding proposition.
Right.
But yes, it made money, and he didn't realize in the beginning that for press to run commercially, you can't sustain it just by your own writings.
Right.
You have to publish other people. You have to publish business things like forms and application forms and other forms to keep the press running.
But he
and when he was in Bombay, when he went to Bombay, his press workers actually went on strike against him. So that is why I think Amrit Rai is a bit more embarrassed than he need be in this book.
In fact, I was about to ask you a question about his Bombay days.
Yeah.
Because for him, it was another avenue that could have secured him some financial independence. And by 1930s, a number of Hindi writers were gainfully employed in Bombay cinema. And I'm thinking of Sudarshan, who worked in the 1930s and wrote screenplay for the 1934 Ramayan, worked in several Sohrab Modi films, Nitin Bose's Dharti Mata. When Premchand decides to go to Bombay, Shivrani Devi says that don't go there, the climate is bad and your gut health is poor. And Premchand says that if I go to Bombay, the reach of my literature, which is now limited by literacy, will enhance. How do you look at the Bombay phase of Premchand?
Well, it was a temptation to which he yielded. All over the world, in Hollywood as well. Aldous Huxley was writing for Hollywood. Fitzgerald was writing for Hollywood. So there were a number of people writing all over the world. It was a new medium, exciting medium. It would reach more people. It will have another kind of appeal on them. So everybody was excited and tempted. And people who were working in the Parsi theatre, many of the Urdu writers, and after that it carried over into IPTA as well, the progressive theatre. They adapted to films more easily.
Right.
Hindi writers, some of them did, Sudarshan, but Bhagwati Charan Verma worked for a while and came back again to novel writing.
Right.
Premchand had a one-year contract for 8,000 rupees, which was quite a substantial amount of money. but not as much as Manto was earning in the 1940s when he left India for Pakistan. He was earning much more. So there was a temptation for him to salvage his finances, as it were, through that big money.
But it turned out to be a disappointment of sorts.
Well, not because of what Shivrani Devi said.
Because he found out that many directors could not read Devanagari.
Even now they can't. Even now, perhaps a larger number. Many lyricists can't.
So if this was a
It's
disappointment...
basically an Urdu Parsi theatre medium.
Right.
It remains so. Now they read only Roman, not even Urdu.
Right.
Earlier they used to read Urdu.
Right.
The people like Dilip Kumar and so on.
Right.
So that's one thing. But what Premchand objected to was because it's a mass medium,
Right.
because a lot of money has to be invested,
Right.
and because there is great pressure to get that money back with profit, therefore they descended to a kind of popularity first and then vulgarity, which he just could not bear. That was the main reason he was disenchanted.
Right.
That's the reason documented in his letters to many friends at that time. But he was there, he had the experience. He toured around South India where he'd never been out of that money. He also did some other things and he came right back to Banaras.
The film, the Bombay episode was a bit of a disappointment. The press was a moderate success at best. What were the achievements, the highlights of his career, the way you see it?
Well, I mean, he's the greatest novelist in Hindi and Urdu. What more could one wish for? So that must have gratified him quite a lot. And it's not only Godan. You know, the reputation of Godan is slightly fortuitous.
Right.
Premchand was asked just before he published Godan, I think the year before he published Godan, when he'd published all his other novels already, he was asked, which is your best novel? And whenever he was asked this, initially he'd say, you know, they're all the same to me. I like all of them. They're like children to me. How can I distinguish? After all that, if he was pressed further, he would say, Rangabhumi. And anybody who's read Premchand seriously, who's read more than Godan and more than Kafan, will agree with Premchand. He knew that that was the great Gandhian novel, which he had written very soon after Gandhi's advent on the scene. 1920s is Gandhi's major movement, first major movement. 1925 in January, already this huge novel is out. So that's his great achievement. He knew by then that he was perhaps the top Hindi novelist. He had already begun to be translated into many languages in India and abroad.
Quite a
into
realization.
Japanese, into English, yes.
It's quite a
in modern review, quite early, right. Tagore took no notice of him, but other Bengalis also did. So that was a great achievement.
Professor Trivedi, it's not every day that a scholar of your stature graces a television studio, and it may interest the viewers to know what is your earliest memory of reading Premchand? What impressions you had of Premchand while reading his stories and novels? And when you translated the book, were those impressions transformed? Are you reading more of Premchand or less of Premchand now?
I think you know, we all were introduced to Premchand, unless we were exceptionally, singularly different in our childhood, through school textbooks. It's through school textbooks that we discovered him. Everybody's impression, I don't know anybody who's resisted Premchand.
Right.
Everybody's impression is that he catches you by the throat as soon as you read the first paragraph. You are drawn into the story. The narrative is so lively, is so compassionate, is so sympathetic. He can create a character in just a couple of lines, and then you are blown along with that. So he had these great qualities of a narrator, and he had idealism. So when one is younger, idealism has more of an appeal, idealism of all kinds.
Right.
So all that was part of the appeal. As about reading Premchand then and reading Premchand now, my sense is that literature has lost ground.
Why is that?
Well, you know, one would need, I think, 1 or 2 hours to discourse on that. But one is popularity of so-called media, social media, smaller exchanges. Just an emoji is enough for most people these days. How would they read anything longer? How would they enjoy it? That training is gone. And the talk about literature enshrining higher values like religion did once upon a time, that talk is also passé, is gone. The nobler values, they laughed at the word noble. So a number of things have gone into it.
Thank you, Professor Trivedi, for this wonderful episode and your insightful comments and observations on Premchand.
Thank you, Gautam. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. I'm sure our viewers would have loved it. And thank you for watching Likhawat. We'll meet you the next episode with a new book, with a new guest. Keep watching Sansad TV. I'm your host, Gautam Choubey. Namaste.